Ethan Reyes opened his eyes and saw dirt. The wet cobblestones pressed against his cheek. Rain was pouring down in a solid wall. The air reeked of rotten fish and horse manure. He tried to stand up and slipped on something soft. Manure. Of course, manure. Ethan got down on his knees and looked around. A narrow street, wooden houses with crooked shutters. People in coarse cloaks walked past, paying him no mind. One man shoved him with his shoulder and muttered something incomprehensible. Ethan looked at his hands, the same fingers, only dirty. He felt his face, the same face. His body ached as if he'd fallen from the third floor. The last thing he remembered was the headlights of a truck at 4 a.m. on an empty road. White light, a crash, and that was it. He must have died. Maybe he had died. But the dead don't feel wet socks squelching inside their boots. A cart loaded with sacks drove by. 4 guards with halberds walked on either side. Ethan automatically estimated the weight of the cargo. 300 kilograms. One of the sacks came untied and coins spilled out. Copper ones. A guard picked them up and stuffed them back inside. Copper under escort. They were transporting copper under the escort of 4 armed men. Ethan sat right down in a puddle and stared at the cart. He'd spent 7 years in the markets. He knew what inefficiency looked like. And what he saw before him was inefficiency on such a scale that his hands started to itch. He stood up. His legs were shaking. His head was spinning. But his mind was already working. Ethan headed toward where there were more people. He decided that whether this was a dream, a delusion, or the afterlife, he needed to find the square no matter what. People trade in marketplaces. Where there's trade, you can understand how the world works. He found a marketplace after 3 turns. A market, dozens of stalls, fish, grain, fabrics, clay pottery, and money changers. When Ethan saw the money changers, his heart began to beat faster. 3 tables in a row. On each were scales and stacks of coins. Copper on the left, silver on the right. Ethan approached the first table. Behind it sat a heavy-set man with a red face. Ethan pointed to the copper coins and then to the silver ones. The money changer held up 4 fingers, then 2. 42 copper coins for 1 silver one. Ethan moved on to the second table. He did the same thing. The second money changer held up 4 and 2. Same exchange rate. The third table. 4 and 2. Ethan laughed out loud. Passers-by turned around. A woman carrying a basket recoiled. Ethan couldn't stop himself. The spread between copper and silver was 42%. It was the same at all 3 money changers. That meant there was no competition. It meant the money changers had colluded. It meant the whole city was overpaying nearly half the value on every transaction. Ethan stopped laughing. He wiped his face with his wet sleeve and looked at the square with new eyes. Over there, that merchant is counting on his fingers and frowning. That farmer over there is shifting copper coins from one palm to the other, trying to figure out if he has enough for a sack of salt. That woman over there is arguing with the fishmonger because yesterday the fish cost 7 copper coins and today it's 9. No records, no receipts, no ledgers in sight. Everything is counted on fingers. Everything is memorized. Everything is based on trust in one's word. Ethan realized 3 things at once. First, he's in another world. Second, there is no banking system in this world. Third, he is the only person here who knows what liquidity is. The rain grew heavier. Ethan stood in the middle of the square, wet and dirty, without a single coin in his pockets. He needed shelter. He needed food. He needed a piece of paper. He set out to find a tavern. The first tavern at the edge of the square looked like a shed with a sign. The sign featured a rusty anchor. Ethan pushed open the door. It was warm inside. It smelled of beer and bread. The room was half empty. Behind the bar stood a woman in her 30s, broad shoulders, strong arms. Her hair was tucked under a headscarf. She looked at Ethan, and her face expressed what means the same thing in any world. Just another ragamuffin. Ethan approached the bar. He didn't know the local language, but when the cashier held up her fingers, Ethan understood her. Maybe the language worked. Maybe the transfer had activated some kind of built-in translator. Ethan opened his mouth and said he needed a room. The woman raised an eyebrow. The words came out fine. She asked if he had any money. Ethan replied that he had no money, but he could work. The woman snorted. She said she had plenty of workers, but not enough paying guests. Ethan looked at the counter. A notebook lay on it, rough paper, ink stains. He asked if he could take a look. The woman shrugged. Ethan opened the notebook. It was a ledger. Who drank how much, who owed how much. The entries were listed in columns. Name, number of mugs, amount. Ethan flipped through the pages and counted in his head. 3 minutes later, he looked up. He said that, according to her records for the past month, 3 people owed her more in total than she earned in a week, and that one of those 3 would most likely never pay because his debt was growing with every visit and he hadn't made a single payment. The woman froze. She asked how he knew about Vern. Ethan didn't know who Vern was. He'd just read the numbers. The woman was silent for about 10 seconds. Then she poured him a mug of beer and said that the room on the second floor cost 3 copper coins a day. She'd give him 3 days for free. If he couldn't find a way to pay within 3 days, he'd have to leave. Ethan took the mug. The beer was warm and bitter. He took a sip and asked her name. Mira Cold. Ethan told her his name. Mira nodded and turned back to the barrels. Ethan went up to the second floor. The room was small. A bed, a table, a stool, a window with fogged-up glass. Outside the window, rain into the roofs of Cross Market. Ethan sat down on the bed. The mattress was stuffed with straw. He took off his wet boots and socks. He placed them against the wall. He looked at his bare feet, then at the ceiling. Then he closed his eyes. He thought about his mom, about the roof he'd promised to fix, about the truck at 4 in the morning, about how he'd closed out the last quarter with a 2% profit and considered it a success. 2%. In a world where the currency exchange spread is 42%. Ethan opened his eyes. He stood up. He walked over to the table. On the table lay a stub of a candle and nothing else. He needed paper. He needed ink. And he needed 3 days. He went downstairs and asked Mira for a sheet of paper and something to write with. Mira gave him some wrapping paper used for fish and a broken piece of a charcoal pencil. Ethan thanked her and returned to his room. He sat down at the table. He smoothed out the paper. It smelled like herring. He began to write. At the top, he wrote one word: assets. Then he drew a line and wrote the second: liabilities. For the first time that crazy day, his hands stopped shaking. Ethan didn't sleep all night. By morning, the wrapping paper was covered with writing on both sides. He mapped out what he knew: copper coins, silver coins, gold coins he hadn't seen yet, but had heard about in the square. An exchange rate fixed by money changers. No paper instruments. No debt obligations except verbal ones. No banks. One continuous barter system spiced with metal. In the morning, he went down to the hall. Mira was already working. She was kneading dough while scolding the boy who had broken the jug. Ethan sat down at a corner table and began to listen. He listened all day. Every conversation in the tavern was a source of information. An old fisherman complained that salt prices had gone up again. A merchant told a fellow traveler that the road to Copper Bridge had become dangerous and caravans now traveled only with an escort. 2 women were discussing how the Money Changers Guild had raised the exchange rate last week and now gave 38 copper coins for a silver coin instead of 40. Ethan took it all in. By evening, he knew the names of the 5 nearest cities. He knew that the empire to the east was called Valenheim. He knew that in a year and a half, there would be some kind of great audit that everyone feared. And he knew that the Money Changers Guild in Cross Market was controlled by a man named Garvik Toll. On the second day, Ethan went out to the square. He walked among the stalls and observed. He kept track. How many people were buying grain? How many were paying with copper? How many with silver? How often they approached the money changers? How much they exchanged at a time? By noon, he saw what he was looking for. A middle-aged woman approached a money changer and placed a handful of copper coins on the table. She wanted silver. The money changer counted it. She was 2 copper coins short. The woman began to plead. The money changer shook his head. The woman left empty-handed. 10 minutes later, she returned with 2 copper coins and made the exchange. During that time, the price of what she wanted to buy with silver had risen by 1 coin. She lost out twice, on the spread and on time. Ethan stood and watched. There it was. There was that crack through which the prosperity of an entire city was leaking away. Not theft, not robbery, just friction. Transaction costs amounting to half the economy. He returned to the tavern. Mira was standing behind the bar and looked gloomier than usual. Ethan asked what had happened. Mira explained. In 2 weeks, a caravan would arrive for beer. She had to pay the brewer in advance with silver. There was no silver. All she had were barrels of beer that hadn't been sold yet. Usually, she borrowed from the moneylender, 30% a month. Then it took her half a year to pay it off. Ethan listened, and a plan was already taking shape in his mind. He asked Mira for some more paper. She gave it to him. He sat down at the table and began to write. Wrapping paper, a charcoal pencil. The text was simple. The bearer of this paper will receive 1 barrel of light beer from the tavern by the Harvest Festival. Signed, Mira Cold, Proprietress. Witness, Ethan Reyes. He wrote 12 such receipts. 1 receipt was good for 1 barrel. Then he showed them to Mira. Mira read them and looked at him as if he were crazy. She asked why she needed these slips of paper if the brewer only accepted silver. Ethan said he would go to the brewer himself. Mira shrugged. She had nothing to lose. On the morning of the 3rd day, Ethan found the brewery. It stood on the outskirts of town by the river, a large stone building with 2 chimneys. The brewer's name was Olaf Brown, a burly man with a beard and hands the size of ham hocks. He looked at the receipts and then at Ethan, then back at the receipts. Then he asked if Ethan was sick. Ethan wasn't offended. He explained. Olaf would sell those 12 barrels in a month anyway. Mira is his regular customer. She always pays late. The IOUs are a guarantee that she'll pay, not with silver, but with goods. Olaf said he needed silver, not paper. Ethan nodded. He said that by tomorrow morning he'd bring 3 of Olaf's customers who would buy beer from him in exchange for similar IOUs from other taverns. Olaf wouldn't lose anything. He'd get barrels from Mira in exchange for the IOUs and sell his barrels to other taverns, also in exchange for IOUs. Turnover would increase. Silver would no longer be a bottleneck. Olaf was silent for a long time. Then he said he'd give Ethan 1 day. If there are 3 customers tomorrow, he'll accept Mira's IOUs. If not, then Ethan should never show his face there again. Ethan nodded and left. By evening, he'd visited 4 taverns on neighboring streets. He went in and looked for owners facing the same problem as Mira's, money tied up in goods rather than coins. 2 owners sent him away. 1 listened but refused. The 4th tavern owner, named Ron Keller, unexpectedly took an interest. Ron had a problem worse than Mira's. He owed a loan shark for 3 months, and the interest was piling up. Ethan explained the system with the IOUs to him. Ron listened. Then he brought in his neighbor, who was also a tavern owner. Ethan explained it again. By nightfall, he had 3 tavern owners willing to give it a try. On the morning of the 4th day, Ethan took them to Olaf. Olaf looked at the 3 of them and at their IOUs. He scratched his beard for a couple of minutes. Then he said he'd give it a try. A week later, Mira's IOUs were circulating on 3 streets instead of silver. People bought beer with the paper. The paper was returned to the tavern and burned. Mira paid Olaf without handing over a single silver coin. She stood behind the counter and looked at Ethan. She asked if he was a sorcerer. Ethan replied that it was worse. He was an accountant. Mira didn't understand the word, but she understood the result. She said the room was now free. Ethan thanked her. Then he asked her for more paper, a lot of paper. Mira asked why. Ethan said that beer receipts were just the beginning. Mira looked at him for a long time. Then she pulled a whole stack of wrapping paper from under the counter. She said the paper was herring-stained, but he could write on it. Ethan took the stack and went up to the room. He sat down at the table. A candle was burning. Rain was falling outside the window. He began designing a new type of receipt, one not tied to a cake of beer, but to silver. The face value was 1 silver coin, backed by actual silver in the vault. He drew, crossed things out, and drew again. By dawn, he had a draft. It was messy, covered in smudges, but it was a working draft. On the sheet was a single word that he had circled 3 times. Mark. On the 5th day, a man came to see Ethan, a young guy about 23 years old, skinny, ink stains on his fingers. His clothes were neat but patched in 4 places. He sat down across from Ethan in the tavern and said he'd heard about the receipts. Ethan asked where from. The guy replied that it was from Ron Keller. Ron showed him the paper, and the guy read it 3 times. He said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen in his life. Ethan raised an eyebrow. The guy explained. His name is Dane Arquette. He studied at the Imperial Tax School in Ortenheim, 2 years, top of his class. Then he was expelled. He's a bastard, an illegitimate child. When that came to light, they struck his name from the rolls and sent him back. He came to the wastelands because he had nowhere else to go. He worked as a clerk for a notary for a pittance. He drafted wills and deeds. He hated every single day. Then he saw Myra's receipt and realized that someone here was doing what he'd been taught in school, only better. Ethan listened. Then he asked Dane to write something. Dane took the quill and, in a minute, wrote half a page in neat, small handwriting. The speed was incredible. Ethan could read people by their hands. Dane's hands were those of a man who writes faster than most people think. Ethan asked if he knew how to count. Dane pulled a wooden abacus out of his bag and, in 30 seconds, multiplied 2 3-digit numbers. Ethan hired him on the spot. The salary was 5 silver coins a month. Ethan didn't have 5 silver coins. He said he'd pay with IOUs. Dane laughed and said that was exactly what he'd been counting on. They started working that very day. Ethan explained. Dane took notes. The first thing they needed was a registry. Every IOU had to have a number. Each number was tied to a specific obligation, who issued it, to whom, for how long, for what amount, and where the collateral was held. Dane listened with his mouth agape. Then he asked if that was how the Imperial Treasury worked. Ethan said it was roughly the same, only worse. Dane laughed again. During the first week, they compiled a registry of all the IOUs issued through Mira's Tavern. 37 of them. Each one described, each one numbered. Ethan showed Mira the book. Mira flipped through the pages. She ran her finger along the lines. Then she looked up, her eyes shining. She said that for the first time in her life, she could see all her money in one place, not in a bag, not in her head, on paper. She asked why no one had shown her this before. Ethan said nothing. He knew why. Because the Money Changers Guild and the loan sharks make their money precisely because people don't see their own money. 2 weeks later, a woman came to see Ethan, Hannah Bright, 22 years old, dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, straight back, a gaze that could pierce a wall. She said she wanted to work as a clerk. Ethan said he already had a clerk. Hannah said she was better. Ethan asked for proof. Hannah asked to see his books. Ethan gave her the ledger. Hannah pored over it for an hour. Then she looked up and said she'd found 3 mistakes. Ethan didn't believe her. He checked. She was right. 1 mistake was in the date, the second was in the total, the third was worse. Ethan had counted the same receipt twice under different numbers. Hannah pointed it out and asked if he was doing it on purpose. Ethan looked at her, then at Dane, then back at her. He pointed her chief auditor on the spot. Hannah asked what an auditor was. Ethan explained that it was someone who made sure no one was lying with the numbers, not even himself. Hannah nodded. She said that suited her just fine. Hannah told her story later. Her father was a merchant, a small-time one, who dealt in fabrics. Hannah grew up in his office. She'd been doing the math since she was 6. She'd been keeping the books since she was 12. When her father died of a fever, it turned out the business had been operating at a loss for 3 years. Hannah knew this. She'd told her father. He wouldn't listen. After his death, the creditors took everything. Hannah was left on her own. She tried to get a job with 3 guilds. She was turned down everywhere. They don't hire women. She got by doing odd jobs. She did the bookkeeping for shopkeepers for a few coins. When she heard that some stranger was hiring people and paying them with paper money, she decided things couldn't get any worse. Now there were 3 of them: Ethan, Dane, Hannah. They worked in Ethan's room on the 2nd floor of the tavern. The table was piled high with papers. In the evenings, Mira would bring them bread and beer and shake her head. She said they looked like madmen. Ethan replied that all the best things in the world were invented by madmen. By the end of the 3rd week, Ethan had made a decision. The beer IOUs were working, but they had their limits. 1 IOU equaled 1 barrel. It was barter with a paper intermediary. They needed to take it to the next level. He gathered Dane and Hannah. He laid out his draft in front of them. A new kind of IOU, not for goods, for silver. He explained how it would work. Each receipt is backed by real silver stored in a single location. Anyone can come with a receipt and get the silver. But the trick is that not everyone will come at the same time. That means you need less silver than there are receipts. Dane asked, "What if everyone comes at once?" Ethan nodded. He said that's called a bank run and that they must do everything to prevent that from happening. That requires trust, and trust requires transparency. Every customer can come at any time and verify that the silver is there. Hannah asked where they would get the silver. Ethan smiled. He said the customers themselves would bring the silver. They would deposit their silver for safekeeping and receive receipts. Receipts are more convenient to pay with than coins. They're light. They don't jingle. No need to lug around a wallet. Hannah stared at him without blinking. Then she said that this was either genius or they'd be hanged for it. Ethan replied that it might be both. They needed a space. The room in the tavern was no longer suitable. Ethan spoke with Mira. Mira knew there was an empty barn 3 streets away. The owner had died a year ago. The heirs lived in another town. It could be rented for 4 silver coins a month. Ethan didn't have 4 silver coins, but he had IOUs, which were accepted as money 3 streets away. He went to the heirs and offered to pay with the IOUs. The heirs refused, so he went to Olaf the brewer. By this point, Olaf was the most ardent supporter of IOUs because his turnover had increased by 1/3. Olaf paid for the barn with silver. Ethan promised to repay him with the IOUs plus interest, 4% per annum. Olaf didn't understand what per annum meant. Ethan explained. Olaf thought it over. Then he said he agreed because Ethan was the only person in town whose words matched his actions. The barn was large and cold, with a hole in the roof. Dane boarded up the hole. Hannah swept the floor. Mira brought in a table and 2 chairs. Ethan hung a sheet of paper on the door. 4 words were written on it. Reyes's IOU house. The first month of the IOU house was like walking a tightrope over an abyss. Ethan slept only 4 hours a day. Dane wrote from morning till night. Hannah double-checked every number. The first customer came on the 3rd day after the opening, an old grocer named Gregor Stom. He brought 4 silver coins. He placed them on the table and looked at Ethan with the expression of a man who was certain he was being robbed but was handing over the money anyway. Ethan counted the coins. Dane recorded the transaction in the ledger. Hannah issued 4 receipts, each for 1 silver coin. The receipts were written on paper slightly better than wrapping paper. Mira had found a supplier of writing paper. Each receipt had a number and a date, Ethan's signature, Hannah's signature as a witness, and a seal. Ethan had carved the seal himself from a piece of wood, a crooked letter R inside a circle. Gregor took the receipts and twirled them in his hands. He asked what would happen if the paper got wet. Ethan said that in that case, he would come and get new ones. The entry in the ledger wouldn't go anywhere. Gregor left. The next day, he returned. He said he'd paid his supplier for a sack of salt with one of the receipts. The supplier refused at first. Then Gregor said the receipt could be exchanged for silver at any time at the Reyes House of Receipts. The supplier went to check. Ethan gave him the silver. The supplier stood there for a minute. Then he put the silver back on the table and asked for the promissory notes. Ethan remembered that moment, the moment when a person voluntarily exchanges silver for paper. It was a moment of birth. By the end of the first month, the House of Promissory Notes had 23 clients, 100 receipts in circulation, all backed by real silver in a chest under the barn floor. Ethan knew that the chest under the floor wasn't a solution. It was a temporary measure, but for now, it worked. Hannah kept the books with maniacal precision. She started a separate ledger for each client, a separate ledger for each promissory note, and a master ledger that she reconciled every evening. Dane kept things moving quickly. He could draw up a promissory note in 2 minutes. A new client would come in and leave in 5. It was faster than standing in line at the money changers. Ethan did what he did best. He talked to people. He walked through the market. He went into the shops. He explained, over and over again. A receipt isn't just a piece of paper. It's a promise backed by silver. Most people didn't believe him. Some laughed. A few made threats. But every day, at least one new customer came in. Ethan considered that a victory. In the 6th week, a problem arose. His name was Garvik Toll. The elder of the Money Changers Guild came in person. He entered the granary accompanied by 2 assistants, a large man in his 60s, gray hair, a stern gaze. His hands were adorned with gold rings. He sat down across from Ethan and placed one of the receipts on the table. He asked what it was. Ethan answered. Garvik nodded. Then he asked if Ethan understood what he was doing. Ethan said he did. Garvik leaned forward. He said that the Money Changers Guild had existed in Crossmarket for 80 years. 3 generations of his family had built this business. They provided the city with a stable exchange rate. They guaranteed the quality of the coins. They gave people the confidence that copper was worth copper and silver was worth silver. And now a stranger comes along and hands out pieces of paper that are worth nothing, pieces of paper that anyone can forge, pieces of paper that would burn up in the fireplace in a second. Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt. When Garvik finished, Ethan replied calmly. He said that Garvik was right. Paper is worth nothing. Trust is what matters. If people believe that silver backs the paper, then the paper works. If they don't believe it, then it doesn't work. But here's the thing. People already believe it. 23 customers in a month. And not a single one had come to take their silver back. Garvik was silent. Then he stood up. He said that Ethan didn't understand how this city worked, and that he would soon find out. He left. Hannah had been standing in the corner, listening to the entire conversation. She walked over to Ethan and said that Garvik wasn't the type to make threats for no reason. Ethan nodded. He knew. A week later, the trouble began. 3 customers showed up at the same time and demanded silver. Ethan gave it to them. The chest was a quarter empty. The next day, 2 more came. Ethan gave it to them. Then another one. Someone was systematically sending people to collect the silver. A bank run. Classic. Ethan gathered Dane and Hannah. He explained what was happening. Garvik was testing their resilience. If the silver ran out and even one person didn't get their share, Word would spread throughout the city that the House of Receipts was a fraud, and it would all be over. Hannah asked how much silver was left. Ethan replied, "Enough for 12 promissory notes. 63 are in circulation. If 13 more people show up tomorrow, everything will collapse." Dane turned pale. Ethan thought about it all night. By morning, he had a plan. He went to see Olaf, the brewer. He explained the situation honestly. The Money Changers Guild had organized a raid. "We need silver, temporarily, for 2 weeks. Olaf scratched his beard. He asked why he should take the risk. Ethan said that if the House of Receipts collapsed, the receipts for which Olaf had already accepted payment would become worthless. Olaf stopped scratching his beard. He gave 20 silver coins. Ethan went to see Ron Keller. Same story, same logic. Ron gave 10. Ethan went to see Gregor, the grocer. Gregor gave him 5. By noon, Ethan had 35 silver coins. He returned to the barn. He put the silver in a chest. He opened the door and waited. Only one person came all day. He took the silver and left. The next day, no one came. The raids had stopped. Garvik checked. The silver was still there. The papers were holding up. Ethan had survived his first banking crisis in a world without banks. That evening, he was sitting in the tavern. Myra set a mug in front of him. She said he looked as if he'd aged 10 years in a week. Ethan took a sip. He said he needed security now, because Garvik's next move wouldn't be financial. The bodyguards found Ethan before he found them. In his 8th week in Cross Market, Ethan was walking back from the barn to the tavern through an alley. It was dark. There were no streetlights in that part of town. He heard footsteps behind him, then footsteps ahead. 2 people. Ethan stopped. His heart was pounding. He wasn't a fighter. He was a derivatives analyst who got out of breath carrying a sack of flour. The man ahead stepped out of the shadows, a knife in his hand, stocky, his face covered with a rag. He told Ethan to get out of town, that the papers were gone, that next time would be the last. Ethan raised his hands. He wanted to say something. He didn't get the chance. Something flashed to his right, quickly, silently. The man with the knife doubled over and fell. The second man behind him screamed and ran off. Standing in front of Ethan was a girl, not very tall, black hair down to her shoulders, dark clothes, a short sword in her right hand. Her left hand was free. She looked at Ethan calmly. She said the man on the ground would live. She struck him in the solar plexus with the hilt. He'd lie there for an hour and then leave. Ethan asked who she was. She introduced herself as Kira's son, a mercenary, silent Blade clan. Works in the wastelands as a contract bodyguard, currently between contracts. She'd been watching Ethan for 3 days, not because she'd been hired, because she was curious. She'd heard about the receipts. She wanted to understand what kind of person hands out paper instead of money, and yet isn't afraid of the Money Changers Guild. Now she understood. It wasn't that he wasn't afraid. He simply didn't think about it. Ethan swallowed hard. He asked how much her services cost. Kira named her price, 20 silver coins a month. Ethan whistled. He didn't have that much, but he offered her something else, 10 silver coins a month in cash, plus storage of the remaining 10 in marks at 4% per annum. Kira asked what percent per annum meant. Ethan explained. If she deposited 10 silver coins at the House of Receipts, in a year's time she'd have 10 silver pieces and another 40 copper pieces on top of that, just for letting the money sit there. Kira was silent. Then she asked why she'd be paid 40 copper pieces if she wasn't doing anything. Ethan explained. Her money isn't just sitting there. He uses it. He issues promissory notes. Receipts drive the economy. They generate turnover. A portion of the profit from that turnover is returned to her as interest. Kira listened. Her expression didn't change. Then she said that for 23 years of her life, she'd been paid to beat people up, to stand by and intimidate them, for killing when ordered to. No one had ever once offered her a way to earn money simply because her money existed. She agreed. From that day on, Kira walked beside Ethan, silent, attentive. She didn't talk to clients. She didn't help with paperwork. She stood by the barn door and watched everyone who entered. That was enough. People stopped being rude. Merchants who used to raise their voices now spoke quietly. Ethan noticed one more thing. After Kira arrived, the number of new clients increased. He didn't immediately understand why. Then he realized. Security is a sign of seriousness. A money changer sits at a table with scales. A banker sits at a table with security. People sense the difference. By the end of the second month, the House of Receipts had 41 clients. 150 receipts were in circulation. The silver in the chest was enough to cover 40%. Ethan considered this a healthy reserve. Hannah thought it was madness and talked about it every evening. Dane thought they were both right. Ethan began to think about the next step. The receipts were working, but they were handwritten. Dane wrote each one by hand. It was slow. It was easy to forge. It was impossible to scale up. He needed a printing press, or at least someone who knew how to make stamps and molds. He asked Mira if she knew anyone who worked with metal and engraving. Mira thought for a moment. She said there was a woman named Selma living on the outskirts of town. She drinks, but she has golden hands. They say she used to work at the Imperial Mint. Ethan went to see Selma that same day. Kira went with him. Selma lived in a dilapidated house by the city wall. Pieces of metal and broken tools were scattered around the house. The door was open. Inside it smelled of smoke and cheap wine. Selma Ogorek was sitting at her workbench. 34 years old, short-cropped hair, a burn scar on her left arm. Her eyes were intelligent but tired. She looked at Ethan and asked what he wanted. Ethan said he needed someone who knew how to engrave printing plates. Selma asked what he was planning to print. Ethan took out a receipt and placed it in front of her. Selma picked up the paper. She held it up to the light. She turned it over in her hands. Then she looked at Ethan, and her expression changed. She said she'd seen something like this before, in Ortenheim. The Imperial Treasury prints tax certificates. It's a similar principle, only it's backed by gold and the crown. Ethan nodded. He said that his receipts were backed by silver and trust. Selma snorted. She asked if he knew why she had left Ortenheim. Ethan said he'd heard she'd been accused of debasing the currency. Selma pressed her lips together. She explained. Her supervisor had ordered her to reduce the silver content in the coins by 10%. He pocketed the difference. Selma refused. She was accused of debasing the coins herself. She was stripped of her rank. They nearly hanged her. She fled. 6 years ago. She's been living here ever since. She drinks, and she hates everything connected to the empire and its money. Ethan listened. Then he said one thing. He said that the empire corrupts its coins from the top down. He wants to create money that can't be corrupted from the bottom up. Money that's transparent. Money that serves the people, not the crown. And he needs the best engraver on the continent to make them so beautiful and secure that they'll be impossible to counterfeit. Selma was silent for a long time. She finished her wine. She set down her mug. Then she asked how much he was paying. Ethan named the salary, 8 silver coins a month, plus a percentage of each new print run of receipts. Selma asked what a percentage of the print run meant. Ethan explained. Selma thought for a moment. Then she stood up and walked to the far wall. A canvas bag hung there. She took it down and untied it. Inside were tools, chisels, engraving tools, molds, and punches, all wrapped in oiled cloth. Everything was spotless. She hadn't touched them in 6 years. But she hadn't thrown them away either. She turned to Ethan and said she'd start tomorrow. Ethan held out his hand. Selma looked at it, then she shook it. The handshake was firm, the hand of a master. A week later, Selma brought the first die, a copper plate with engraved text. The House of Reyes Receipts, denomination 1 silver mark, serial number, space for the date and signature. Along the edges, a delicate ornament that could not be replicated without her tools. Ethan held the mold in his hands. He ran his finger along the lines. Every line was smooth and precise. He looked at Selma. She was standing up straight. For the first time in 6 years, she was standing up straight. Ethan said it was beautiful. Selma replied that it would be beautiful once she finished the second mold, the one with the watermark. Ethan didn't know that watermarks were possible in this world. Selma explained that it wasn't a watermark as he understood it. It was an embossed design on wet paper. She knew how to do it. She had done it for imperial decrees. The first print run was ready by the end of the 3rd month. 50 new style receipts, printed, with serial numbers, with an embossed mark, with Ethan's signature and Hannah's seal. They lay on the table in the barn. 5 people stood around them: Ethan, Dane, Hannah, Kira, Selma. Mira peeked through the door and, seeing their faces, came in as well. She picked up one receipt and held it up to the light. The embossed mark appeared as a shadow, the letter R inside a circle. Mira said it looked like real money. Ethan replied that it was real money. It's just that the world doesn't know it yet. The first printed batch was distributed in 9 days. 50 receipts went out into the city and began to take on a life of their own. Every evening, Ethan and Hannah checked the ledger together: who had received one, to whom it had been passed on, and where the receipt was now. It was a map of trust, a living, moving map. A single receipt could pass through 5 hands in a single day. The grocer paid the butcher with it, the butcher paid the farmer took it to Mira's tavern for dinner. Mira put it in a box and used it to pay for flour the next morning. The miller would bring it to the house of receipts and exchange it for silver. But the thing was, the miller was exchanging it less and less often. He started passing the receipt along instead. The chain grew longer. The silver stayed in the chest. The paper kept circulating. By the middle of the 4th month, Ethan had printed a second batch, 100 receipts. Selma cut out a new template with improved security features. Now each IOU had 2 embossed symbols, the letter R and a small anchor. The anchor was Mira's idea. She said that people in Cross Market trusted the anchor because it was an old symbol of the city. Ethan agreed. He understood that money wasn't just math. Money was a story that people told each other, and the anchor was part of that story. The problem came from where Ethan least expected it, not from Garvik Toll. It came from the customers. In the 5th week of the 4th month, a farmer from the outskirts came to see Ethan. He placed a receipt on the table and said he wanted silver. Ethan looked at the receipt. The number didn't match any entry in the registry. The paper looked similar, the text looked similar, but there was no embossed seal. It was a forgery. The first forgery. Ethan showed the receipt to Hannah. Hannah turned pale. She said that if forgeries entered circulation, trust would collapse within a week. Ethan showed the receipt to Selma. Selma took the paper and studied it for 10 minutes. Then she said the workmanship was crude. Someone had carved the stamp out of wood. The text was crooked. The lines were uneven. But to someone who doesn't know what to look for, the forgery would pass as genuine. Ethan gathered the team. 6 of them sat around a table in the barn. He explained that the forgeries weren't a disaster. It was a sign that the receipts had become valuable enough to be counterfeited. Hannah said that was cold comfort. Ethan agreed. He proposed 3 measures. First, Selma would add a 3rd level of protection, colored ink that she knows how to make from mineral dyes. It's impossible to replicate the color without her recipe. Second, each receipt would have a tear-off stub. The stub stays at the house of receipts. The receipt goes to the customer. Upon presentation, the receipt is verified against the stub. Third, Ethan will publicly announce that the house of receipts verifies every receipt when exchanging it for silver. Forgeries are not accepted. Anyone who brings a forgery will be handed over to the guards. Selma worked for 3 days. She made new ink, dark green with a copper sheen, beautiful. Impossible to make without a specific mineral she found by the river. The 3rd batch was different. Green ink, a tear-off stub, a new embossed mark in the form of intertwined lines. Ethan posted a notice on the barn door. Dane wrote it in large letters. All old-style receipts must be exchanged for new ones within 2 weeks. Old receipts will be invalid after this deadline. It was a risk. If people got scared and came for silver instead of an exchange, there would be a run on the store. Ethan was counting on something else. He was counting on laziness. People would prefer to exchange paper for paper rather than paper for silver, because silver is heavy. His calculation proved correct. Within 2 weeks, 93% of the old receipts had been exchanged for new ones. 7% came for silver. Ethan handed it over without question. The chest grew lighter but held up. The forgeries stopped, for the time being. Now Ethan was thinking about something else. Garvik. The elder had been silent for 2 months since the raid. That was a bad sign. Garvik's silence meant he was planning something serious. Ethan asked Kira to find out what was going on at the Money Changers Guild. Kira was gone for 2 days. She returned with information. Garvik hadn't been sitting idly by. He had traveled to 3 neighboring cities. He had met with the heads of the local Money Changers Guilds there. He was forming a coalition. 4 cities, 4 guilds, all against the House of Receipts. Garvik's plan was simple and ruthless. Declare Reyes's receipts fraudulent and pressure the Cross-Market City Council to ban paper promissory notes. If the council refused, the 4 guilds would simultaneously stop accepting any goods from people who used promissory notes. A trade blockade. Ethan listened to Kira and sketched on a piece of paper. He drew circles and arrows, flows of money, flows of goods, who depends on whom. An hour later, he looked up. He asked Hannah how much silver in total passed through Cross Market's Money Changers in a month. Hannah checked her records. About 400 silver pieces. Ethan asked how much of those 400 passed through the clients of the House of I.O.Us. Hannah replied, about 120. Ethan nodded. 1/3 of the market. In 4 months, he'd taken 1/3 of the market away from Garvik. No wonder the old man was angry. But that third represented both Ethan's strength and his weakness. Strength because 1/3 of the market was too much to ignore. Weakness because 2/3 still belonged to Garvik. Ethan had been thinking all night. He couldn't go to war with 4 guilds. He didn't have the resources. He didn't have the political clout. He didn't have an army. But he had something else. He knew what each of these people wanted. Money changers want a commission. Merchants want turnover. Moneylenders want interest. And they all want one thing: stability. That morning, Ethan dressed in the best clothes he had. A clean shirt, pants without holes. He asked Mira to lend him her late husband's vest. Mira looked at him. Then, without a word, she took the vest out of the chest. Dark blue, with silver buttons. Ethan put it on. He went to Garvik's, alone, without a guard. Kira wanted to go with him. Ethan said no. If he went with a sword on his back, it would be a conversation of force. He wanted a conversation of reason. Kira said that reason doesn't stop a knife. Ethan replied that a knife won't stop an idea. Kira looked at him as if he were an idiot, but she stayed. Garvik Toll's house stood in an affluent neighborhood. Stone, 2 stories, a carved door. A servant opened it. Ethan gave his name. He was shown into the study. Garvik was sitting at a desk. On the desk were scales and stacks of coins. A lifelong habit. Even at home, he counted. Ethan sat down across from him. He began to speak. He spoke for half an hour. He said he hadn't come to fight. He said he understood Garvik's fear. 30 years of work, family, legacy, everything was at stake. He said that the receipts wouldn't destroy the money changers. The receipts would destroy the dirty 42% spread. But if the money changers joined the system, they'd get something else. They'd become exchange points for the House of Receipts. Every money changer's table in the square would become a drop-off and pickup point for receipts. For each transaction, they'd get 2%, not 42. 2. But there'd be 20 times as many transactions, because when a transaction is cheap, people trade more often. Garvik listened without interrupting. His expression didn't change. When Ethan finished, Garvik remained silent for a minute, 2. Then he asked how Ethan knew there would be more transactions. Ethan pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket. It contained a table showing the volume of transactions processed by the House of Receipts over 4 months, a 12% increase per week. If extrapolated, in half a year, the volume would exceed the current turnover of the entire Money Changers Guild. Garvik took the sheet. He studied it for a long time. Then he looked up. He said that Ethan was either a genius or the best liar he'd ever met. Ethan replied that it might be both. Garvik didn't smile, but he poured 2 glasses of wine. He handed one to Ethan. He said he would explain to him once again what an interest rate was. Ethan took the glass. He said he'd be happy to listen. The negotiations with Garvik lasted 2 weeks. Every day, Ethan came to his house. Every day they sat at the table and did the math. Garvik turned out to be not the man everyone thought he was. He wasn't a greedy old man clinging to his profits. He was a cautious man who had spent 30 years building a system and feared that an outsider would destroy it in half a year. And he was right about one thing. Ethan was indeed destroying his system. But he was offering another one in its place, a better one. On the 3rd day of negotiations, Garvik asked the question Ethan had been waiting for. He asked what would happen when the Empire found out. Ethan answered honestly, "The Empire will find out. It's inevitable. The question isn't whether it will find out. The question is what it will see when it looks. If it sees rebellion and chaos, it will send a legion. If it sees a functioning trade system that pays its taxes on time and poses no threat to the crown, then perhaps it will decide it's easier to leave everything as it is." Garvik listened. He said Ethan was naive. The Empire won't leave everything as it is. The Empire does not tolerate competitors. Ethan nodded. He said that was exactly why he needed Garvik, an elder of the Maniac Guild with a 30-year reputation, a man known in 4 cities. If Garvik stood alongside the House of Receipts, he would no longer be just an outsider with pieces of paper. He would be an institution. Garvik thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, he came to the granary. He was accompanied by 2 of his senior money changers. He placed a bag of silver on the table, 50 coins. He said this was his contribution to the House of Receipts Reserve Fund, and that the Cross-Market Money Changers Guild would become the clearinghouse for exchanging receipts for silver and vice versa. The commission would be 2%, but on one condition. Garvik would join the House of Receipts board as an equal partner, not subordinate, a partner. Ethan held out his hand. They shook hands. Hannah recorded everything in the Articles of Incorporation. Dane authenticated the signatures. Kira stood by the door, staring at Garvik without blinking. Selma was drinking in the corner, muttering that the world had gone mad. Myra brought beer for everyone. Garvik's joining changed everything. In just 1 week, the number of customers doubled. People who didn't trust Ethan trusted Garvik. The 3 exchange desks in the square were now accepting receipts. This meant that anyone in the city center could, at any moment, exchange paper for silver and silver for paper. The barrier to entry had disappeared. By the end of the 5th month, there were 400 receipts in circulation. The silver reserves were sufficient to cover 35%. The rest circulated throughout the city and returned each time someone brought a receipt to the house or to the money changers. Ethan began to think about the next step. Cross-Market was just 1 city. 12 free cities lay in the wastelands, each with its own economy, each with its own problems. If the receipts circulate only in Cross-Market, they'll remain a local currency, just a local piece of paper. For the token to become a real currency, it has to work everywhere. The first city outside Cross-Market was called Highland, a 2-day journey north, a small town, 3,000 residents. The main industry was salt mining. Highland was always in need of grain. Cross Market needed salt. Caravans traveled between them, slow, expensive, and dangerous. Each caravan carried silver one way and goods the other. If the silver was stolen, the caravan lost everything. Ethan saw an opportunity in this. If merchants from Highland accepted Cross Market's receipts, the caravan could travel without silver, just the goods. It makes no sense to rob a wagon loaded with salt. Salt is heavy. Bandits wouldn't steal the horses because they're branded, and a single person could carry the receipt in their pocket. Ethan sent Dane to Highland. Dane was against it. He said he didn't know how to negotiate. Ethan replied that he didn't need to negotiate. He just needed to show the ledger. The numbers speak for themselves. Dane left. Kira sent along one mercenary from Silent Blade whom she'd hired on a temporary contract. Dane returned a week later. 2 merchants from Highland came with him. They wanted to see the House of Receipts with their own eyes. Ethan gave them a tour. He showed them the chest of silver. He showed them the ledgers. He showed them the register. He showed them the stubs. He showed them the embossed marks on the receipts. The merchants felt the paper. They checked the marks. They leafed through the books. One of them, the elder named Cornelius Holt, pored over the ledger for half an hour. Then he looked up at Ethan. He said that in 40 years of trading, he had never seen anyone record every single coin. Ethan explained that this was called double-entry bookkeeping. Every transaction is recorded twice: income and expense, debit and credit. If the totals don't match, it means there's a mistake or theft somewhere. Cornelius was silent. Then he said quietly that he'd thought he was poor his whole life. But it turns out he doesn't know whether he's rich or poor because he's never kept proper accounts. Ethan heard this and something stirred inside him. He remembered why he was doing this. Not for profit, not for power. For this moment. When a person sees their money for the first time and realizes it isn't their enemy. Cornelius returned to Highland. A month later, he sent a messenger. The Highland Merchants Guild was ready to accept cross-market receipts for intercity transactions. The terms? A 2% commission, a dedicated exchange office in Highland, and 1 representative from the House of Receipts stationed in the city at all times. Ethan sent Dane, this time for good. Dane had been promoted. He became the manager of the House of Receipts branch in Highland. The salary is 12 silver pieces a month, in stamps. Dane was leaving that morning. He stood by the wagon and couldn't bring himself to say goodbye. He said he never thought a bastard from Ordenheim would be opening a bank branch. Ethan said there were no bastards at the House of Receipts. There were employees. Dane nodded. He climbed into the wagon and drove off. Ethan watched him go. Then he went back to the barn. He needed a new clerk. And he needed a new clerk yesterday. By the 6th month, the Cross Market brand was already operating in 3 cities: Cross Market, Highland, and the small port town of Stone Harbor in the south. Stone Harbor had joined on its own. Merchants from there had heard about the receipts and came to check it out. Ethan wasn't surprised anymore. He'd figured out the pattern. The first city was the hardest. The second was easier. The third came on its own. Trust scaled up. But as the scale grew, so did the problems. The main problem was that Ethan was still doing too much himself. He handled negotiations. He balanced the books. He checked the reserves. He trained new clerks. He went to the market. He spoke with customers. He slept 4 hours a day and started dozing off at his desk. Hannah was the first to notice. She came to him that evening and placed a sheet of paper in front of him. It was a diagram. The structure of the House of Receipts, laid out like a tree. At the top was Ethan. Below him were 4 branches: accounting and auditing, headed by Hannah; printing technology and security, headed by Selma; regional offices, headed by Dane; security, headed by Kira. Hannah said that if Ethan didn't stop doing everything himself, he'd die a second time, and this time from exhaustion, not from a truck. Ethan looked at the chart. He smiled. He said he'd forgotten the most important rule of management: delegation. Hannah asked what delegation was. Ethan explained that it's when you stop doing what others do better than you. Hannah nodded. She said she handled the accounting better than he did. It was a fact, not a compliment. Ethan agreed. From that day on, he handed over full control of accounting and auditing to Hannah. Selma was already working independently. Kira managed security without his involvement. Dane ran Highland. Ethan now had his hands free for what he was supposed to be doing: strategy. And strategy required a new tool: forwards. Ethan had been thinking about forwards from day one: a contract to deliver goods in the future at a price agreed upon today. The simplest derivative instrument. In his world, they taught this in the second year of college. Here, it didn't exist. Farmers planted wheat in the spring and prayed until fall. If the harvest was good, prices fell, and they could barely make ends meet. If the harvest was bad, prices skyrocketed, but they had nothing to sell. In both cases, they lost out. Ethan wanted to fix that, but he needed a reason. The reason presented itself. At the beginning of the 7th month, a girl arrived in Cross Market. Not a little girl, a young woman, 19 years old, barefoot, dusty. She'd been walking for 3 days. Her name was June Ha. She was looking for a man with papers. Ethan met her in the barn. June sat on the floor because there weren't enough chairs. She told her story. Her family lived on a farm 2 days' journey to the west, the village of Windmill. Last fall there had been a drought. A third of the harvest had been lost. Grain prices had quadrupled. June's family had grown what was left of their wheat, but couldn't sell it. The middleman offered 3 copper coins per measure. That didn't even cover the cost of the seeds. June's mother was sick. There wasn't enough food. They sold the wheat for 3 copper coins and lived on meager rations for half a year. Then a man from Cross Market arrived, a merchant. He explained that there was a man in the city who gave out little pieces of paper that could be used to buy things, and that this man spoke strange words, but his words worked. June didn't understand half of it, but she grasped the main point. Someone had figured out how to ensure that money wouldn't be the enemy. She set out for Cross Market, a 3-day walk, without any money, without food, with one question. Was it possible to ensure that her mother would never go hungry again? Ethan listened. He listened, and a plan began to take shape in his mind. Not an abstract one, a concrete one, for a specific family, for a specific village. He asked June how many farms there were in Windmill. 23. How many of them grow wheat? 17. What's the average yield in a good year? June gave him a number. Ethan did the math in his head. Then he took a piece of paper and began to draw. He drew 2 columns. The left column is today's price of wheat. The right column is the price in 6 months. There's an arrow between them. He explained to June. Imagine that today you're selling wheat that hasn't been grown yet. The buyer pays you now, not the full price, but it's guaranteed. If the harvest is good, you'll get less than you could have gotten on the open market. But if the harvest is bad, you'll still get your money, because the contract has already been signed. The buyer takes on the risk, and you get stability. June looked at the drawing. She didn't understand the word derivatives. She didn't understand the word hedging, but she got the gist of it. She asked, "Who's the fool who'd pay for wheat that doesn't even exist yet?" Ethan laughed. He said that fool is called a speculator, and that a speculator isn't a fool. He simply believes the harvest will be good and the price will fall. Then he'll buy the wheat cheaply under the contract and sell it for a high price on the market. And if he's wrong, he loses. The risk shifts from the one who can't bear it to the one who's willing to bear it. June thought about it. Then she asked if she could stay. Ethan asked why. June said she wanted to learn. She wanted to go back to Windmill and explain to the farmers how it worked. But first, she had to understand it herself. Ethan looked at Hannah. Hannah nodded. June stayed. Myra gave her a room next to the kitchen in exchange for help in the mornings. During the day, June sat in the barn and studied. Hannah taught her numbers. Kira taught her how to hold a knife. Sama grumbled that the barn had become too cramped and too crowded. 2 weeks later, Ethan drew up his first forward contract. The buyer was Cornelius Holt from Highland. He agreed to buy wheat from Windmill at a fixed price in 6 months. The price was 5 marks per 10 measures. The current market price was 4 marks. Cornelius paid a premium of 1 mark to guarantee delivery. The 17 Windmill farms received money now, partially, as an advance, the rest upon delivery. June took the contracts to Windmill herself. She returned 5 days later. Her father came with her, an old farmer with a weather-beaten face. He walked into the barn and saw the ledgers and receipts, Hannah at the table, Selma at the printing press, and Kira by the door. He stood there for a minute. Then he walked over to Ethan and said that his daughter had explained to him what a forward contract was. He didn't understand everything, but he understood that for the first time in 30 years, he wouldn't have to pray for rain. Because even if it didn't rain, he'd still get the money. The old man fell silent. Then he asked if he could give Ethan a hug. Ethan said yes. The old man hugged him. His hands smelled of earth. The forward contract with Windmill was the spark. Word spread throughout the wastelands within a month. Farmers from 4 villages came to Cross Market to ask if they too could sell their harvest in advance. Ethan couldn't handle it all by himself. He needed a system. He convened a meeting of the House of Receipts. Now there were 4 members on the council: Ethan, Hannah, Garvik, and Mira, whom Ethan had brought in a month ago as a representative of retail customers. At first, Mira refused. She said she was an innkeeper, not a banker. Ethan replied that an innkeeper who had learned to read a balance sheet in 6 months was, in fact, a banker, just without a degree. At the council meeting, Ethan proposed a plan to create the Hall of Obligations, a place where sellers and buyers meet and enter into forward contracts, not through Ethan personally, but through the system. A standard contract, standard terms, a standard commission. Garvik asked who would guarantee the fulfillment of the contracts. Ethan replied that the House of Receipts would. If the seller fails to deliver the goods, the House of Receipts will refund the buyer's money from a reserve fund, and then it will recover the funds from the seller. Garvik asked, "What if the seller runs away?" Ethan said that's why a deposit is needed. The seller puts up 10% of the contract value as a guarantee. If they fulfill their obligation, the deposit is returned. If not, the deposit covers the buyer's losses. Hannah raised her hand. She said that 10% was too little. She suggested 15. Ethan looked at her. Then he nodded. He said that Hannah was right, and that was exactly why she was the chief auditor. Myra asked where this hall would be located. Ethan said that the barn was already too small. They needed a new space. Garvik suggested the old trading hall of the Money Changers Guild, a large building on the square, 2 stories, the trading hall downstairs, offices upstairs. The guild hadn't used it for 3 years because trading had moved to street stalls. Garvik said he would provide the building for free as his contribution to the cause. Ethan accepted. They moved everything in 2 days: the chest of silver, the books, Selma's printing press, Hannah's table. The new building smelled of dust and old wood, but it was big, and it had a door with a lock. Kira approved. The Cross Market Hall of Obligations opened at the beginning of the 9th month. Ethan would remember the first trading day forever. 12 people came that morning, 7 sellers and 5 buyers. The sellers were farmers: wheat, barley, salt. The buyers were merchants from 3 cities. Ethan stood in the middle of the hall and explained the rules. Each seller announces what they are ready to sell, what goods, what quantity, what price, and what delivery date. Each buyer announces what they are willing to buy. If the prices match, a contract is concluded. If they don't match, the parties negotiate. The House of Receipts records every transaction. It takes a deposit. It guarantees fulfillment. The commission is 3% from each party. The first transaction took 40 minutes. A farmer from Windmill sold 50 measures of wheat to a merchant from Stone Harbor at a price of 4.5 marks per 10 measures. The delivery period is 3 months. The deposit is 6 marks. Hannah recorded everything in the ledger. Dane sent a letter from Highland saying that the merchants there also wanted to participate. Ethan replied that they should send representatives. By the end of the first week, 11 deals had been made in the hall. The total volume was 120 marks. Ethan was the first market maker. He stood in the center of the hall and matched buyers with sellers. He explained the terms, he calculated prices, he settled disputes. A month later, he began teaching others, 12 students, young clerks and merchants' assistants. Ethan taught them to read supply and demand. He taught them to calculate prices based on volume and time frame. He taught them to ask the right questions. One of the students, a young man named Tom Lane, turned out to be a real talent. He had a feel for the market. He could look around the trading floor and predict 5 minutes in advance which deals would take place. Ethan appointed him senior broker. Tom was so proud he couldn't speak for the rest of the day. By the end of the 9th month, up to 30 trades were being made on the trading floor each week. Wheat futures, barley, salt, iron, wool. Farmers from 6 villages were selling their crops in advance. Merchants from 4 cities were buying. Prices stabilized. Not because anyone was controlling them, but because information had become transparent. Everyone could see all the prices. Everyone knew all the volumes. Speculation based on ignorance became impossible. But it was precisely at that moment, when the system began to function, that what Ethan feared most happened. A crop failure. A real one. Not a partial drought like last year. A total one. The rains stopped in the middle of summer. 3 weeks without a drop of rain. The fields turned yellow. Farmers came to the hall looking like old men, even though many weren't even 30. Grain prices began to rise. 5 marks for 10 measures, then 6, then 8, then 12. Panic was spreading. Merchants from Stone Harbor sent a messenger asking whether the House of Receipts would guarantee deliveries under the old contracts. Ethan replied yes. The House of Receipts guarantees it. Because 6 months ago, when no one knew about the drought, the House of Receipts had entered into forward contracts with farmers at the old price. The farmers received advances. They planted their crops. They grew their crops. Yes, the harvest is smaller, but there is a harvest, and it's already been sold at 4.5 marks per 10 measures, not 12. Ethan gathered everyone in Cross Market Square. It was a hot, dusty day. The crowd stood in silence. Ethan climbed onto the platform usually used by town criers. He wasn't an orator. He was an analyst, but now he had to speak. He said that the House of Receipts was buying wheat under a forward contract signed 6 months ago at a price of 1 mark per measure and was selling it today at a price of 1 mark per measure to anyone who presented a receipt. The crowd didn't understand. Hannah climbed onto the platform next to him. She explained it more simply. 6 months ago, they bought grain from the farmers in advance. They paid even if there was a poor harvest. They paid. Now they're selling it at the same price. They're not profiting from hunger. Silence hung in the air for a few seconds. Then an old woman in the crowd began to cry. Then there was a murmur. Then they began to applaud. Ethan stood on the platform and watched. He didn't feel triumph. He felt exhaustion and relief. The system had worked. Not him. The system. The forward contract, devised at a table in a barn 6 months ago, had just saved 3 cities from starvation. The next day, 8 imperial merchants arrived at the Hall of Obligations. They stood in the doorway, looking at the price board, the brokers, and the ledgers. The eldest among them approached Ethan. He said he wanted to join the clearinghouse. Ethan asked which one. The merchant said the one Ethan would create, because after today, any idiot can see that the future lies in paper, not gold. After the drought, everything accelerated. Ethan felt time squeezing in. 10 months had passed, 8 remained until the Great Audit. If the wastelands didn't create a unified financial system by then, the empire would swallow them whole without firing a single shot. Tax stamps, imperial gold, the end of freedom. Ethan began working on the Wastelands Clearinghouse. The idea was simple in theory and insanely complicated in practice. 12 cities, each with its own economy, its own guilds, its own interests, its own fears. Uniting them into a single financial system meant convincing people who didn't even trust the city next door to trust a piece of paper from Crossmarket. Ethan drew up a plan. 3 stages. The first stage was the Core Alliance, 3 cities that already accept the currency: Crossmarket, Highland, and Stone Harbor. They sign the founding charter of the clearinghouse. They standardize receipts. They standardize accounting. They standardize commissions. The second stage is expansion. Invite 5 more cities, not by force, through economic arguments, to demonstrate that cities within the chamber trade faster and more cheaply than those outside. The third stage is full coverage. All 12 cities, a single currency, a single reserve fund, a single exchange. Hannah said the third phase was impossible. Ethan replied that the first one had seemed impossible 10 months ago, too. He started with visits. Every 2 weeks he traveled to one of the cities. Kira went with him. Horses, dirt roads, overnight stays in roadside taverns. Ethan hated riding. After every trip, his whole body ached. Kira said nothing and rode alongside him. One evening at a roadside tavern between Crossmarket and the 4th city, Bridgewater, Ethan sat at a table rubbing his back. Kira sat across from him, sharpening her sword. Ethan said that in his world, people rode in iron wagons on smooth roads and didn't feel a single bump. Kira asked why he was telling her about his world. Ethan fell silent. He didn't know why. Maybe because Kira was the only person with whom he could be honest. With Hannah, he was the boss. With Dane, the mentor. With Myra, he was a partner. With Garvik, a strategist. With Kira, he could just sit and be silent. Or talk nonsense. Kira sheathed her sword. She said she didn't care where he came from. What mattered to her was where he was going. Ethan looked at her. She wasn't smiling. She never smiled, but her eyes were gentle. He nodded and finished his beer. Bridgewater turned out to be a problem. The city was under the control of the Moneylenders Guild. Their leader, a man named Marcus Lowe, was smarter than Garvik and more dangerous. Garvik was afraid of losing his business. Marcus was afraid of losing his power. The moneylenders in Bridgewater had every other resident in debt: farmers, artisans, shopkeepers, even the town mayor. Debt is control. If the House of Receipts came to Bridgewater with cheap loans and transparent terms, Marcus wouldn't just lose his commission, he'd lose the town. Ethan met with Marcus. The conversation lasted 3 hours. Marcus wasn't rude. He was polite, attentive. He asked intelligent questions. He offered Ethan tea, 3 sips. He said he admired what Ethan was doing, and that it would be a shame if it ended badly. Ethan understood the threat. He returned to Crossmarket and thought it over for a week. Bridgewater couldn't be taken head-on. He couldn't offer Marcus a partnership like he had with Garvik. Marcus didn't want to be a partner. He wanted to be the boss. The solution came at night. Ethan was poring over a map of the wastelands, 12 cities, trade routes. Bridgewater stood at the intersection of 2 major roads. Half of the trade between the north and the south passed through it. That's why the moneylenders are so powerful. They control the crossroads. But what if the crossroads lost its importance? What if goods started taking a different route? Ethan pulled out his calculations. A new trade route from Highland to Stone Harbor via Copper Bridge, bypassing Bridgewater. It's a day's journey longer, but it's 20% cheaper because it avoids Marcus's usurious markup. If merchants start taking the detour, Bridgewater will lose its transit traffic. And without transit traffic, Marcus will lose his debtors. And without debtors, he'll lose his power. Ethan didn't make any threats. He didn't make an announcement. He simply offered the merchants of the chamber a new route as an option. Not mandatory, just more convenient, cheaper, safer, and without usurious markups. 2 months later, a third of the caravans were bypassing Bridgewater. Marcus noticed this by the end of the first month. By the second month, he was calculating his losses. By the third, he sent a messenger to Cross Market. The messenger delivered an invitation. Marcus Law would like to discuss the terms of Bridgewater's admission to the Wasteland Clearinghouse. Ethan smiled. He showed the letter to Hannah. Hannah read it and shook her head. She said that I, Ethan, was a scary man. Ethan replied that he wasn't scary, he just knew how to count. By the end of the first year, 5 cities had joined the chamber: Cross Market, Highland, Stone Harbor, Bridgewater, and the small mountain town of Irongate, which joined because its blacksmiths wanted to sell iron through the Hall of Obligations. 7 cities remained, and 8 months until the audit. But at the end of the first year, something else happened. Dane sent a package from Highland. Inside were old papers found in the town hall archives, dusty scrolls. Some were over 200 years old. Dane had included a note. It contained 3 sentences. He found a receipt, signed in handwriting unlike any local script. The letters were rounded, slanted to the right. That's how people write who learned to write in another language. Dane had seen that handwriting in only one place, in Ethan's notes. Ethan held the old receipt in his hands. The paper was brittle with age. The ink had faded, but was still legible. The text was in the local language. But the handwriting. Ethan recognized that handwriting. Not specifically, the general style, Latin cursive, English handwriting. 300 years ago, someone in this world wrote the same way people write in the world Ethan came from. He sat down. He placed the receipt on the table. He stared at it for a long time. St. Martin, the man who introduced the Empire's gold standard, the man who was burned at the stake. A time traveler. Ethan wasn't the first. Someone had been here before him, and that someone had built what Ethan was now destroying. He put the receipt in a drawer. He locked the drawer. He hung the key around his neck. He didn't tell anyone, not yet anyway. He needed to think. Outside in the hall, Mira was pouring beer. Hannah was arguing with Garvik over the commission rate. June was learning to write the word forward as Kira dictated it. Selma was engraving a new mold for a stamp run. Tom Lane was haggling with a merchant from Irongate. Life went on. The system was working. But somewhere in the Ortenheim archives lay a book written by a man with the same handwriting as Ethan's, and that book could change everything. The Empire's first assassination attempt took place quietly, without an army, without a declaration, just one man. Ethan was returning from the Hall of Obligations that evening. Kira was walking 3 steps behind him. The street was empty. Every other street light was on. A man emerged from around the corner, not a mercenary from the square, a professional. Black clothing, no insignia, a short blade in each hand. He moved so fast that Ethan saw only a shadow. Kira saw more. She shoved Ethan aside and stepped between him and the attacker. The sound of steel on steel. 2 strikes. 3. Kira took a step back. The man advanced. He was good. Better than the mercenaries Garvik used to hire. This was on a whole other level. Kira parried the sword with both hands. She shifted her stance. Ethan saw her face turn to stone. She was no longer defending herself. She was attacking. 5 seconds. The man was lying on the ground. His left arm was pinned to his side. Blood. He tried to get up. Kira put her foot on his chest. She asked who had sent him. The man remained silent. Kira pressed down harder. The man said one word. Treasury. Ethan stood leaning against the wall. His knees were shaking, his hands too. He wasn't cut out for this. He was cut out for spreadsheets and calculations, not for blood on the pavement. Kira tied the man up and dragged him into the hall's basement. By morning, Ethan knew everything he needed to know. The Imperial Inquisition of the Treasury, the Secret Service, financial crimes against the crown. Head, Cassius Verne, Lord Treasurer. The man who personally ordered Ethan's elimination. Not his arrest, his elimination. Ethan sat at the table, staring at the wall. Hannah brought him tea. He didn't touch it. He was thinking. The Empire knows, sooner than he expected. The receipts are circulating through 5 cities. The mark has become the region's second currency. Of course the Empire knows. It was foolish to hope they wouldn't notice. The question now isn't whether they'll notice. The question is what to do once they have. Ethan called a council meeting. He told them everything about the assassination attempt, about the Inquisition, and about Cassius Verne. Garvik turned pale. He said that the Treasury Inquisition was no joke. They don't send an army. They send one person, then another, then a third, until the target is dead or has fled. Mira clenched her fists. She asked what they could do. Ethan replied, "Speed things up. If the Empire decides to send a legion, the 5 cities won't hold out. But if the Chamber unites 8 or 10 cities, it's no longer just one merchant's rebellion. It's an economic bloc. The Empire can't destroy 10 cities without consequences. A third of the black market runs through them. The border garrisons rely on them for supplies. If the wastelands collapse, the Empire will lose its buffer zone." Hannah said they needed a diplomat, someone who could speak to the imperial nobility in their own language. Ethan knew who it was. He'd known for 3 months, but he'd kept quiet because he wasn't sure. Lillian Verne. She'd shown up at Crossmarket 4 months ago. She introduced herself as a traveling aristocrat from Ortenheim. She was interested in trade. She wanted to see the wastelands with her own eyes. She was charming, smart. She played the part of the naive woman so skillfully that most people believed her. But not Ethan. Ethan noticed 3 things. Her dresses were expensive but not new. She knew the protocol of the imperial court by heart. And she asked questions that only someone familiar with finance could ask. Not a merchant, not a clerk. Someone educated. Ethan asked Kira to check. Kira checked. Lillian Verne. Cassius Verne's cousin, sent to the wastelands as an observer, a spy. Ethan didn't expose her. He began showing her everything, books, calculations, plans, not secret things, but the essence, how receipts work, how the Hall of Obligations is organized, how farmers sell their harvests in advance and no longer go hungry, how an old grocer saw his balance sheet for the first time and burst into tears. Lillian watched. She took notes. She went back to her room, and she didn't send any reports. Ethan knew because Kira was keeping track of the couriers. Lillian wrote 3 letters in 4 months. She sent one, a short one, nothing substantial. She burned the other 2. Ethan came to see her after the assassination attempt. He sat down across from her and said he knew who she was. Lillian's expression didn't change. She asked how long he'd known. Ethan said since the first month. Lillian asked why he hadn't kicked her out. Ethan replied that kicking out a spy meant losing a line of communication with the enemy, and he doesn't want to lose that channel. He wants to use it. Lillian was silent. Then she said that Ethan didn't understand. She doesn't send reports not because she works for him. She doesn't send them because she can't write down what she sees. Because if she writes the truth, her cousin will send the Legion, and she doesn't want the Legion to come anymore. Ethan asked why. Lillian replied quietly, because for the first time in her life, someone was interested in her opinion about things. Not about the people she had access to, about things, about how money works, about how trust works. Her whole life, she'd been a useful relative, a face, a tool. Ethan was the first to ask what she thought, not who she knew. Ethan looked at her. He saw genuine pain in her eyes, the pain of someone who'd spent her whole life as a function rather than a person. He reached out his hand. He offered her a seat. A diplomat for the Wasteland Clearinghouse, the face of the House of Receipts before the imperial nobility. She would speak on behalf of the clearinghouse with those she knew, and she would do so not as a spy, but as a representative. Lillian took his hand. She said her cousin would never forgive her. Ethan replied that forgiveness wasn't part of the business plan. Lillian turned out to be a weapon Ethan had underestimated. In 3 months, she visited 6 cities. She spoke with the city elders in a language they understood, not numbers, not calculations, status. Lillian explained that the clearinghouse was not about submission to cross-market. It was a union of equals. Each city retains its own government. Every city gets a seat on the council. Every city uses a common currency and a common exchange. And every city receives protection from the empire that a single city could never obtain on its own. She spoke gently. She never pressured anyone. She simply presented the figures Ethan had prepared and translated them into the language of power. Here's how much your city loses on currency exchange spreads. Here's how much your farmers overpay to loan sharks. Here's how much your merchants spend on guarding silver caravans. And here's how much they'll spend if the caravans carry paper instead. 6 of the 7 remaining cities sent delegations to cross-market within 2 months. 3 joined immediately. 2 more haggled over the terms. 1 refused. A small city right on the border with the empire. Its leader feared imperial wrath more than poverty. Ethan didn't press the issue. He said the door was open. When it was ready, let it come. By the 15th month, there were 8 cities in the clearinghouse. The mark had become the primary currency of the wastelands. The commitments hall was open every day. Futures contracts were traded on 6 types of commodities. Tom Lane had built a team of 30 brokers. Selma printed the 4th batch of marks with a new level of security. The watermark had become more complex. Now, when held up to the light, a small owl was visible. Selma chose the owl because she said owls can see in the dark, like a good auditor. Hannah blushed when she was told this, but said nothing. By the 18th month, Ethan had launched the next phase, a short position against imperial gold. He'd been preparing this for half a year, quietly, through Lillian and her old connections in Ortenheim. The scheme was simple in theory. Frontmen in the capital borrowed imperial gold. They sold it on the market for marks. They bought goods with the marks. They waited. When the gold's value dropped, they bought it back more cheaply and repaid the debt. The difference was theirs to keep. But for the gold's value to drop, people had to stop trusting it. And for that to happen, an alternative had to emerge. The mark was already an alternative in the wastelands, but in the empire, it was unknown. Ethan started simple. He made arrangements with merchants who traded between the wastelands and the empire. They began offering imperial counterparties settlements in marks without insisting, simply demonstrating that the mark was more stable. Imperial gold was losing value every year because the Ortenheim Mint was secretly reducing its metal content. Lemma knew this. She worked at that mint. She knew the exact figures. Over the past 10 years, the gold content in imperial coins had fallen by 14%. No one in the empire knew this except the treasury. Ethan knew. And he quietly spread this information through the merchants, not as a rumor, as a fact, with figures, with proof. Scales don't lie. Any merchant could weigh an old coin against a new one. The difference was obvious. By the 20th month, the imperial coin had begun to lose value, slowly, 2% a month. Merchants on the border began to prefer marks, then merchants in the border towns, then merchants in the central provinces. Gold flowed from the empire into the wastelands. Marks flowed from the wastelands into the empire. The balance of power was shifting, quietly, imperceptibly, like water eroding a riverbank. Cassius Verne noticed. He noticed when the imperial coin lost 18% in a quarter. This was no longer a trickle. It was a flood. He sent a second assassin. Kira intercepted him the day before cross-market. She returned with a cut on her shoulder and no details. Ethan asked if he was alive. Kira nodded. Ethan asked what she'd done to him. Kira said she'd sent him back to Ortenheim, with a note. The note contained a single sentence. "Mr. Verne, if you want to talk, come yourself." Ethan hadn't written that note. Kira had written it herself. Ethan looked at her. She was standing by the door, sharpening her blade. The cut on her shoulder was bleeding. She wasn't paying any attention to it. Ethan stood up. He walked over to her. He took a rag and pressed it against the wound. Kira froze. She said she could handle it herself. Ethan didn't move his hand. He said he knew, but he wanted to help. Not because she couldn't, but because she shouldn't have to do everything alone. Kira was silent. Then she let him bandage the wound. Her hands weren't shaking, but her breathing had changed. Quieter, softer. Ethan noticed and said nothing. The Empire outlawed the mark in the 22nd month. The decree came from Ortenheim, bearing the imperial seal. Any subject of Valenheim caught using or possessing cross-market paper obligations is subject to a fine equal to 3 times the value of the discovered papers. A repeat offense is punishable by confiscation of property. Ethan read the decree and set it down on the table. Hannah asked what would happen now. Ethan said that now it was for real. The ban meant 2 things. First, the Empire is afraid. No one bans something that doesn't work. Second, the merchants who already use the marks within the Empire aren't. They'll simply go underground to the black market, to smuggling. And the black market is always more expensive and always more dangerous, and always more profitable for those willing to take risks. Ethan convened an emergency meeting of the chamber, delegates from 8 cities, 23 people in the Hall of Obligations. He stood before them and spoke for an hour. He said that the ban was not the end, it was the beginning of the final phase. He laid out a plan, not to attack the Empire militarily, attack economically, continue to devalue the gold coin, continue to expand the mark's zone of influence, and do one thing the Empire doesn't expect: buy up all the imperial grain. All of it. For the 24th month, forecasts indicated an average harvest in the Empire and a good one in the wastelands. Ethan proposed buying up the maximum volume of imperial grain through frontmen using forward contracts. Pay with marks. Once the harvest was gathered, the grain would physically pass into the chamber's hands. And then the Empire would discover that its own grain belonged to people it had declared outlaws. Garvik listened with a stony expression. When Ethan finished, Garvik stood up. He said that what Ethan was proposing was not a commercial transaction. He was proposing a siege. Without a single soldier, without a single sword. A siege with bread. Ethan nodded. Garvik sat down. He paused. Then he said that he was too old for war, but old enough to understand when war was inevitable. The vote was unanimous. The chamber approved the plan. The next 4 months were the most tense of Ethan's life. The network of frontmen in the Empire was operating at full capacity. Lillian coordinated from cross-market via couriers. Every operation was a risk. Any merchant could be exposed. Any courier could be intercepted. But the system worked. Because the system had one principle. Every participant had a personal stake. Every merchant profited from the operation. No one acted out of altruism. Ethan had built a mechanism where greed worked for the common cause. Hannah kept track of the dual operations, public ledgers for the chamber, shadow ledgers for the imperial network. She worked 16 hours a day. Dark circles were forming under her eyes. Ethan told her she could hire an assistant. Hannah replied that an assistant would see the shadow ledgers. Ethan said he trusted her to choose the right assistant. Hannah chose June. Over the course of a year, June had transformed from a barefoot farmer's daughter into a meticulous, precise bookkeeper. She calculated more slowly than Hannah, but never made a mistake. Hannah said that June had no talent for numbers. She had something better: patience. In the 25th month, Ethan received a letter, not via a messenger, via Lillian. She found it on her desk that morning, unsigned, unstamped. 3 lines. Mr. Reyes, your predecessor also thought he could outsmart the system. He was wrong. You still have time to stop. Ethan read it 3 times. He knew who it was from: Cassius Verne. Not a threat, a warning, Vern wasn't threatening, he was informing, like one professional to another. Ethan walked over to his desk drawer. He pulled out an old receipt that Dane had sent from the Highland archives, Latin cursive from 300 years ago. Saint Martin, the outsider who built the empire and who was ultimately burned at the stake. Ethan laid the two papers side by side, Vern's letter and Martin's receipt. 300 years lay between them, and one question. Why was Martin burned at the stake? Not for what he built, but for changing his mind. Dane had found this in other documents from Highland, fragments, scraps, but the picture was coming together. In the last years of his life, Martin began to have doubts. He had created a system that concentrated wealth in the hands of the crown, the gold standard, a unified mint, tax stamps. All of this made the empire strong, but it made the people poor. Martin realized this too late. He began writing another book, a book about how to create a system for the people, not for the crown. It was burned before he could finish it, but the book existed, somewhere in the Ordenheim archives. Ethan put both papers in a drawer. He knew what he had to do, finish what Martin had started. Not to build an empire, to dismantle the model Martin had created, and to replace it with the one Martin hadn't had time to create. A month later, a famine began in the capital. Not catastrophic, controlled. The grain hadn't disappeared, it was simply too expensive in imperial gold. Because gold had lost a quarter of its value, and the grain was sold for marks. Farmers preferred marks because the mark was stable, gold was not. The rabble of Ortenheim took to the streets. They demanded bread. There was bread, but it was sold for a currency the empire had outlawed. An irony even Martin would have appreciated. Cassius Vern left the capital. He was heading for the wastelands, not with a legion, with a small entourage, 12 men. He was going to talk. Ethan had learned of this from Lillian a week earlier. He began to prepare. Cassius Vern arrived in Crossmarket on a winter day. Snow lay on the rooftops. The streets were clean. The city had changed over the past 2 years. Where there used to be dirty stalls, there were now covered market arcades, signs, streetlights. The pavement had been repaired. The gutters had been cleared. The money that used to leak away to money changers and loan sharks now stayed in the city and put to work. Vern rode on horseback down the main street. He looked around. Ethan knew what he had seen. He had seen a city that lived better than half the imperial provinces and lived without imperial gold. The meeting took place in the Hall of Obligations, a large hall. 20 delegates from the chamber sat at a long table. Ethan was in the center. Hannah was on his right, Garvik was on the left. Kira was by the door. Lillian stood to the side. When Vern entered and saw her, his expression didn't change. Not a single muscle twitched. But his eyes grew colder. He sat down across from Ethan. 12 of his men stood behind him. The silence lasted a minute. Vern spoke first. He said that Ethan had made an impression on the empire, not with an army, not with a sword, but with a piece of paper. It was both impressive and frightening. He said the empire was ready for negotiations, but not for surrender. Ethan nodded. He said he wasn't demanding surrender, he demands recognition. The Wasteland Clearinghouse is an economic entity. The mark is a currency. The Hall of Obligations is a stock exchange. All of this exists and functions. The empire can pretend it doesn't exist, but its own merchants are already trading in marks. Its own farmers prefer marks to gold. Its own common people demand bread that is sold for marks. Vern listened. Then he asked a question. He asked if Ethan knew who St. Martin was. The room fell silent. Ethan replied that he did. Vern said that 300 years ago, Martin had come to Arcalion out of nowhere, just like Ethan. He brought knowledge that didn't exist here, just like Ethan. He built a system, just like Ethan. And the system destroyed him. Vern leaned forward. He said there was a document in the Ortenheim archives, Martin's notes, his last book, the one he never finished. Vern had read it. At the end of his life, Martin wrote that he'd been sent here, not by chance, on purpose. Someone or something selects people from another world and sends them here, each with their own mission. Martin was supposed to build an empire. He did. But then he realized that his empire was a cage, a golden cage. He began to write about how to destroy what he had built, and then they destroyed him, not people, the force that had sent him. Vern fell silent. Then he asked if Ethan wasn't afraid that the same fate awaited him. Ethan was silent. He was thinking. Everyone at the table was looking at him. Hannah, Garvik, Mira, June, everyone. Ethan answered. He said he was afraid, but fear isn't a reason to stop. Martin stopped too late. He tried to destroy his own system alone and from within. Ethan is doing it differently. He isn't destroying Martin's system. He's creating an alternative, not in secret, out in the open, not alone, with 200 people who understand how money works and have no intention of letting that knowledge slip back into the shadows. Even if Ethan disappears tomorrow, the system will remain, because the system isn't him. The system is Hannah and her books, Dane and his branches, Selma and her forms, Tom and his brokers, June and her farmers, Myra and her tavern, Garvik and his tables. They all know how it works, and they'll teach others. Vern looked at Ethan for a long time. Then he said he was proposing the following. The Empire would lift the ban on the mark. It will recognize the Chamber as an economic entity. In exchange, the Chamber will cease operations aimed at devaluing the gold coin. It will resume grain shipments to the capital at market prices, and it will allow imperial observers into the Hall of Obligations. Ethan looked at Hannah. Hannah nodded almost imperceptibly. He looked at Garvik. Garvik nodded as well. Ethan turned to Vern. He said he accepted the terms with one addition. He wanted access to the Ortenheim archives, to Martin's notes, and to the final book. Vern remained silent. Then he asked why. Ethan replied that Martin had begun a work he hadn't finished. Ethan wanted to read it, not to destroy the Empire, to understand why they'd both been sent here. Vern thought for a full minute. Then he stood up. He held out his hand. Ethan shook it. The handshake was firm and cold. Vern said one thing before leaving. He said that Martin used to shake hands too, and that a handshake guarantees nothing. But it's better than a knife in the back. He walked out. The room fell silent. Then Mira said she needed a drink. Everyone laughed. For the first time in 2 weeks. Ethan entered Ortenheim 3 months after the negotiations, not with an army, with a folder of documents and a team of 12 people. Hannah walked on his right with a leather bag full of books. Kira walked on the left with a sword at her belt. Dane had arrived from the Highlands the day before. Selma grumbled that the capital stank worse than the wasteland. June stared at Ortenheim's stone towers with her mouth agape. Mira carried a basket of food because she said she didn't trust imperial cuisine. Lillian walked ahead of everyone. She had returned to the city she had left 2 years ago. But she had returned a different person. Garvik had stayed behind in Crossmarket. Someone had to hold down the fort. He said he was too old for adventures in the capital. Ethan knew that Garvik simply didn't want to see the Empire up close. For 30 years, he had built his world apart from it. That was enough. The Ortenheim archive was located in the basements of the Imperial Treasury. Stone vaults, dust, thousands of scrolls and folders. Vern had granted access as promised. 2 Imperial archivists accompanied the group. They looked at Ethan with curiosity and wariness, the man who had nearly brought down the Empire with a pile of papers. Ethan searched for 3 days. Hannah helped. Dane translated the old records. June fetched scrolls from the far shelves. On the 2nd day, they found Martin's first documents, tax decrees, mint designs, blueprints for scales. All of this was known. All of this was the official history of St. Martin, the benefactor, the father of the Empire. On the 3rd day, Hannah found a locked box in a far corner of the lower level. The lock was rusted shut. Kira broke it open with a single motion. Inside lay a notebook, a thick one. The leather cover was cracked with age. Ethan opened the first page. The handwriting was unmistakable. Latin cursive, English letters, but the text was in the local language. Martin had written for those who would come after him. Ethan read all day. He sat on the stone floor of the archive and read. Kira stood nearby. Hannah sat across from him and waited. Martin wrote about his life in Arcalian. He had come here from London, the 18th century, an economist. He established the gold standard for the empire because he believed it was the right thing to do. A stable currency, a strong state, order. He believed in order. For 20 years, he built the system, the mint, tax stamps, the legions. Everything worked. The empire grew. Martin received a title, lands, honors. And then he saw what was happening on the outskirts. Villages were dying out. Farmers were selling their last possessions to pay taxes. Merchants were becoming slaves to the guilds. Gold was flowing into the capital and never returning. Martin realized he had created a pump that sucked life from the periphery to the center. He tried to fix it. He proposed reforms. The emperor refused. Martin persisted. He was removed from office. He began writing a book about how to create a monetary system for the people, not for the crown. Paper obligations backed by goods rather than gold, a stock exchange, futures contracts, insurance. Everything that Ethan was now doing. Martin described all of this 300 years before Ethan, but he didn't have time to put it into practice. He was burned at the stake for heresy. The charge was false. The real reason was that his book threatened the very foundation of imperial power, the gold standard. The last few pages were different. Martin wasn't writing about economics. He was writing about the force that had sent him. He didn't know what it was, not God, not magic, something else. He had felt its presence in the early days, then it was gone. He was alone. He wrote that he had realized one thing. He hadn't been sent to save the world. He had been sent to play a role, to create a system, a specific system. When he tried to deviate from his role, the force didn't intervene directly. It simply stopped protecting him, and people did the rest. The last sentence in the book was unfinished. Martin wrote that if anyone came after him, they should remember one thing. The system you build must outlive you. If it depends on a single person, it will die with him. If it lives on in people, no force will be able to destroy it. The sentence trailed off. The page was smeared with something dark, maybe ink, maybe blood. Ethan closed the book. He sat on the floor and said nothing. Kira sat down beside him. She didn't ask what he had read. She was simply there. Hannah approached. She placed a hand on his shoulder. She too remained silent. Ethan thought of Martin, the man who had come here 300 years ago with the same knowledge, the same dreams, and who had been destroyed not by enemies, but by his own creation. Ethan had no intention of repeating his mistake. Martin built a system for the crown. Ethan built a system for the people. Martin worked alone. Ethan worked with a team. Martin hid his knowledge in a book. Ethan shared his knowledge with anyone willing to learn. Tom Lane is now training the 5th generation of brokers. Hannah wrote a textbook on double-entry bookkeeping for scribes. June returned to Windmill and teaches farmers' children how to count. Selma trains apprentice engravers. Dane manages a network of 8 branches. Garvik chairs the Chamber's Council. Myra has opened 3 new taverns in 3 different towns. Everyone accepts Marx. Knowledge isn't in books. Knowledge is in people. Ethan stood up. He put Martin's notebook in his bag. Vern allowed him to take a copy. Ethan made a copy that very night. Dane was writing. Hannah checked every word. In the morning, they left the archives. Ortenheim glowed in the winter sun. Stone towers, golden domes, a beautiful city built on a system that sucked the life out of the outskirts. Ethan stood on the steps of the treasury and looked out over the square. People walked by. They traded. They argued. They lived. He thought of his mom, of the roof he'd promised to fix, of the truck at 4 a.m, of his wet socks on the first day. 2.5 years ago, he'd woken up in the mud without a single coin. Today, he stood in the capital of the empire with a treaty recognizing the clearinghouse and a notebook from his time as a traveler in his bag. He hadn't conquered the world. He hadn't slain a dragon. He hadn't assembled a harem. He'd done something else. He'd taught people how to count. Kira walked over and stood beside him. She said it was time to go home. Ethan asked where. Kira looked at him. For the first time in 2 years, she smiled. She said to Crossmarket. Where else? Ethan nodded. They walked down the steps. 12 people, a folder of documents, a bag of copies. Mira's basket was already empty. Kira's sword was on her belt. Hannah's bag was slung over her shoulder. They walked across Ortenheim Square, and people parted to let them through. Not because they were afraid, because they sensed it. These 12 people had just changed the world. Not with a sword, not with magic, with paper and ink. Ethan walked and thought about Martin's last statement. A system that lives within people. He looked at his team, at Hannah, who is the best at math on the continent, at Dane, who went from being a bastard to a manager, at Selma, who had reclaimed her name, at June, who would never go hungry again, at Myra, who went from being a widowed innkeeper to a co-owner of a banking network, at Kira, who for the first time in her life is getting paid for being alive, not for killing, at Lillian, who betrayed her family for an idea, at Garvik, who's waiting for them at Crossmarket and brewing tea. The system lived within them, in each one, and it would outlive Ethan, no matter what the force that sent him here did. They left Ortenheim at dawn. The road lay to the west, through the Silver Seam, through the wastelands. Home. The snow fell quietly. Ethan rode on horseback and, as always, cursed the horses. Kira rode beside him and, as always, said nothing. But now the silence was different. Warm. In Ethan's pocket lay Myra's first receipt, wrapping paper that smelled of herring. He'd kept it, from the very first day. He took it out and looked at it. The letters had faded, the paper had yellowed, but it was real. The first stamp. The first promise. Ethan put the receipt back. He looked at the road ahead. Long, dusty even under the snow. There was still a lot of work ahead. The 9th city, the 10th, the 11th, the 12th. Textbooks, schools, new stock exchanges, new financial instruments, insurance policies, mortgage documents, pension funds. A whole world to build. But that's for later. Right now, there's snow, silence, the road home, and 12 people who know that money isn't gold. Money is trust, and trust can't be burned.